Meeting to order, and as everyone well knows by now, we're doing the Proceeds of Crime, Terrorism Financing Act, the statutory review of that act, and we have a number of witnesses here. Thank you all for coming. We'll hopefully you can keep your opening remarks to about 5 minutes, and then we'll go to questions back and forth. So we'll start with the Canadian Jewelers Association, and then we'll go to the Jewelers Vigilance Canada Incorporated. Brian, Mr. Land.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting the Canadian Jewelers Association to this meeting today. Regarding your review of the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act, my name is Brian Land, and I'm the General Manager of the Canadian Jewelers Association. For 100 years, the CJA has been the voice of the Canadian jewelry and watch industry, providing leadership in ethics, education, and communication, building trust, awareness, and desirability for Canadian jewelry products. The CJA promotes consumer confidence and assists its members to follow best business practices. With over 1,000 locations in Canada, members consist of retailers, manufacturers, wholesalers, and goods and service providers. In 2017, the CJA acquired Jewelers Vigilance Canada, and with the acquisition came the JVC Crime Prevention Program. This 18-year-old program has delivered to industry and law enforcement valuable information on crime against jewelers, including organized crime in the form of gangs. This program also trains law enforcement about specific attributes related to jewelry crime. Joining me at the table is my colleague Phyllis Richard, representing Jewelers Vigilance Canada. I would like to take a few minutes to give you a brief overview of the jewelry industry in Canada. For the purposes of the Act, we are known as Dealers in Precious Metals and Stones, or DPMS, although not all the industry is covered under the Act. In a 1997 Ernst & Young study commissioned by the CJA, it states that over 90% of the 4,400 jewelry firms in Canada have fewer than 20 employees. 65% have fewer than 5 employees. The significance of these statistics defines the fabric of the Canadian jewelry and watch industry 20 years ago. Our industry was, and is even more so today, an industry of mostly small businesses. Many of these small businesses exist in smaller communities across Canada. Often they are the second and third generation jewelers in that same community. They tend to know the vast majority of their customers. The jewelry manufacturing industry in Canada thrived in the latter part of the 20th century, but as so many other industries, the manufacturing sector declined with the advent of offshore and foreign manufacturers who were able to produce jewelry products much cheaper. The world was opening up with the age of the Internet and the online revolution. Well over 20 significant jewelry manufacturers closed their doors or went bankrupt between the latter part of the 20th century and today. Importers, wholesalers, and distributors have become more prominent than manufacturers as suppliers to retailers in Canada. Those Canadian manufacturers still producing have sought other markets such as US, Britain, and Europe to sell to. The retail side of the Canadian jewelry industry has also changed dramatically. Unlike other retail such as clothing and hardware, which are dominated by chain stores, our industry is more small independent retailers. For those chain stores that still exist, such as People's Jewelers, Mappin's Jewelers, and Burke's Jewelers, 3 of the largest chains in the 1960s to the 1990s, they're now owned by foreign companies. In addition, many of the Canadian-owned jewelry chain stores have closed their doors. Retailers like Ben Moss, Walters, and Ostrander's are no longer in business. Big box stores such as Costco and Walmart also carry fine jewelry, and new chain stores have arrived from foreign shores such as Michael Hill from New Zealand. Statistics about the Canadian jewelry industry are not available, other than the Ernst & Young 1997 report. However, it has been documented in the U.S. that approximately 60% of jewelry sales are through multi-line merchants such as Costco and Walmart. In Canada, these types of retailers generally are not part of the CJA. And this would also be true of department stores like the Bay. From an international perspective, it is noteworthy that precious metals, stones, and finished jewelry are not a common medium of exchange in Canada. While some items such as gold bars or ingots may be used as a store of value, this is generally not the case for finished jewelry. It is estimated that in the resale of a piece of finished jewelry in the Canadian market, the loss of value would be between 75% and 95% of the retail price on average. This is to say that an item purchased for $100 Canadian would have a resale value of between $5 and $25 Canadian. Having said that, products that lose less value when resold are the most vulnerable, the same items that are targets by thieves in a robbery: brand name watches and high-end larger diamonds. The CJA is committed to attaining a higher level of AML/ATF compliance within our membership. We strongly believe that a better understanding of the fabric of our industry by the Department of Finance and FinTrack will lead to a more realistic compliance requirements and, in turn, a much higher rate of compliance. I look forward to any questions after my colleague gives an overview of the DPMS sector and the AM/ATF compliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Land. Turning to Ms. Richard with the Jewelers Vigilance Canada Incorporated.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity to comment on your review of the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act. My name is Phyllis Richard. I'm the former Executive Director of Jewelers Vigilance Canada and now serve as Chair of the Canadian Jewelers Association Government Relations Committee. With my colleagues' overview of the Canadian jewelry industry in mind, I would like to speak to the dealers in precious metals and stones sector and their requirements under the Act. Unlike other reporting entities, there is no licensing requirements specific to the part of the DPMS sector covered under the Act, and very few specific regulations in general that pertain to jewelers. This is in sharp contrast to many other reporting entities, such as financial institutions, who have a very structured and regulated environment. The parts of the DPMS sector captured under the Act are entrepreneurial in spirit and business practices outside, of course, of the multi-line retailers such as Costco, Walmart, and the Bay. As a general rule, the DPMS sector at the independent retail and wholesale levels lacks technological sophistication with a limited communication channel. This is in contrast to the mining sector, which embraces new technologies and has a significant level of sophistication. In reviewing the vulnerabilities to money laundering within the captured segment of the DPMS sector, various products present various risks. These risks need to be understood in order to develop measures to mitigate these risks. As an example, cut, polished, and/or finished gemstones may in some cases be used as a store of value. The liquidity of markets available are highly dependent on the type of stone, with diamonds generally having more available and stable markets than colored stones. In the case by stable, we are referring to the valuation of an item when assessed by different parties. In the case of colored stones, the assessed value of an item can vary significantly. Within the more liquid diamond trade, there are a number of controls in place to ensure the pedigree and authenticity of stones, in particularly those of high value. These include processes put in place to ensure that diamonds have points of origin outside of known conflict zones. While such processes are neither universal nor perfect, they are believed to have significantly impacted corruption in the diamond trade. In addition, there is a trend towards more transparency about diamonds and gemstones. In the case of diamonds, we are seeing some major mining companies looking towards blockchain as a method to bring transparency to the product history. Finished jewelry purchased at retail rates represents little money laundering or terrorist financing risk in the Canadian context, in particular when these items are bought and sold at retail rates. To the best of our knowledge, there are very few money laundering topologies that involve the actual purchase and/or sale of finished jewelry in a retail setting. Unlike finished jewelry, precious metals in the forms of bars, ingots, and/or coins may be used as a store of value. However, such items have limited liquidity, particularly in large quantities at jewelry retail. The sale of high-value items would often require interaction with a regulated entity or an auction house. Many jewelers purchase and/or accept trades of broken scrap or resale jewelry. These items are most often melted down in order to extract the precious metals and either used to create new items or sold for the value of the metals. The risk posed in such cases is that these items themselves may be the proceeds of crime as stolen property. Insofar as we are aware, most jewelers collect identification and KYC information in the case of such transactions and do not accept such transactions if the property in question is believed to be stolen. Where property is believed to be stolen, local law enforcement may also be contacted. As such, retail jewelers are not likely to be the path of least resistance for criminals that wish to dispose of stolen property. The exception here would be bad actors, which unfortunately exist. My colleague mentioned the JVC Crime Prevention Program. The many security steps taken by members to this program have inherent AML mitigating properties. These would include video cameras, staff training, and in the case of wholesalers and manufacturers, trade references as a requirement. Within the DPMS sector, there's a segment of industry that is not covered but would seem to be vulnerable to money laundering, and that is namely auction houses. We hope this gives the committee some insight into the complexity of the DPMS sector, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Richard. Turning then to the Federation of Law Societies of Canada, Ms. McPherson, President, and Ms. Wilson, Executive Director, Policy and Public Affairs. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to provide comments to the committee in conjunction with your review of the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act. By way of background, the Federation is the coordinating body of the 14 governing bodies of the legal profession of Canada, which together regulate more than 120,000 lawyers, 3,800 notaries in Quebec, and nearly 9,000 licensed paralegals in Ontario, all in the public interest. I want to start by assuring you that the Federation and its member law societies support Canada's efforts to fight money laundering and terrorist financing. We recognize the importance of the objectives of the Act, and we support those objectives. As the Supreme Court made clear in its 2015 decision, in meeting those objectives, it is imperative that important constitutional principles be respected. You will have heard a number of witnesses describing the resulting situation resulting from the 2015 decision as a major gap in Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regime. With respect, these comments ignore the fact that the Federation and the Law Societies of Canada have demonstrated their commitment to protecting the public by taking meaningful constitutional action in this area. Our written submission, Mr. Chairman, outlines the efforts of the Federation and the law societies to ensure that there is effective regulation of the legal profession in this area. So in the interest of time, I will only give a few details as to what steps the Federation has taken in this regard. The no cash rule developed by the Federation in 2004 and implemented and enforced in every law society in Canada prohibits legal counsel from receiving cash in amounts over $7,500 in the aggregate from a single client or for a single client matter. And it requires legal counsel to keep a record of cash transactions as part of their accounting record keeping. It bears noting that the threshold in the Federation's rule, $7,500, is stricter than that in the regulations for reporting large cash transactions, being $10,000. While we have taken a different approach than the government, the rule addresses the risks associated with the handling and placement of large amounts of cash and has been recognized by government representatives, including the Minister of Finance in office at the time the rule was implemented, as an effective alternative to the large cash reporting requirements that apply to other reporting entities under the federal anti-money laundering regime. When the government introduced client verification regulations, rather than simply pursuing a remedy in the courts, the Federation and the law societies moved proactively in drafting and in adopting a second model rule, this one establishing extensive client identification and verification obligations. This rule, in force in all jurisdictions since 2008, closely tracks those in the financial regulations. Together, the two rules, the no cash and the client ID rules, achieve the following objectives. They impose on lawyers and Quebec notaries a rigorous standard with respect to cash transactions, and they limit the ability of legal counsel to accept cash from clients. On this point, I would note that these restrictions are unique. Legal counsel elsewhere, including in the United States, are permitted to accept cash in any amount. These two rules also impose extensive due diligence requirements on legal counsel. These rules also address the activity of lawyers and Quebec notaries as financial intermediaries, but they do so through law society regulations rather than through federal legislation. And thirdly, these rules respect the constitutional principles articulated by the Supreme Court of Canada in its 2015 decision. And it's important to understand that these two rules also exist within a larger legal and regulatory context. Canadian lawyers and legal counsel are bound by the criminal law and, like everyone else in the country, can be subject to prosecution for engaging in money laundering and terrorism financing activities. In addition, legal counsel are subject to comprehensive rules of professional conduct imposed and enforced by the law societies that prohibit them from engaging in or facilitating unlawful conduct in any way. All members of the legal profession are also subject to comprehensive financial and accounting regulations by virtue of their membership in their various law societies. We note in its 2016 Mutual Evaluation Report on Canada, the Financial Action Task Force was critical of law society regulation to combat money laundering and the financing of terrorist activities, suggesting that there was no incentive for the profession to apply these measures or to participate in the detection of potential money laundering and terrorist financing activities. In the view of the Federation, this suggestion ignores the serious regulatory initiatives of Canada's law societies in this area and the ongoing monitoring that law societies engage in, including both periodic and risk-based audits. Measures to ensure that legal counsel comply with law society regulations include annual reporting obligations, practice reviews, and financial audits. Law societies also have extensive investigatory and disciplinary powers that include the ability to impose penalties up to and including disbarment when members fail to abide by the law society rules and regulations. In the submission of the Federation, any actual or perceived gap in the legislative scheme as a result of the exclusion of the legal profession from the provision of the Act has been filled by the actions that the law societies have taken. We do recognize, however, that it is important to ensure that the regulations in this area are as robust and as effective as possible. To that end, the Federation is currently engaged in a comprehensive review of its model rules and the associated compliance and enforcement measures used by the law societies. We have just completed a consultation on proposed amendments. Comments were due in by March 15th, and we are currently now reviewing those comments. This consultation process will clarify some of the provisions, and it will also add additional obligations on Canadian legal counsel. Most notable amongst the proposed additional obligations is a proposed requirement for legal counsel to obtain and verify the identity of beneficiaries of trusts and the beneficial owners of organizations. In addition, requirements for ongoing monitoring of the professional relationship and activities of clients have also been proposed. The special working group, which is currently conducting the review, has also proposed a new model rule that would tie the use of trust accounts to the provision of legal services, thus ensuring that lawyers' trust accounts cannot be used for purely financial transactions. A comparable rule is already in place in Ontario and Quebec, and a number of Canadian jurisdictions, which together regulate approximately 75% of the lawyers in Canada. Final rule amendments are expected to be approved by the Federation's governing board in June of this year, and to be implemented by law societies across the country later this year. We also recognize that effective enforcement of the rules is critical, and for that reason, we are also reviewing law society compliance and enforcement activities, and we are preparing guidance on best practices to assist law societies. Additionally, equally important, in our view, is that members of the profession should understand their legal and their ethical obligations. And to this end, we are currently preparing comprehensive guidance and educational materials that will focus on compliance with the various rules, but also on understanding the money laundering and terrorism financing risks that lawyers and Quebec notaries may encounter in their professional activities. We anticipate that in addition to general guidance, these educational materials will provide specific guidance aimed at different practice groups, particularly those practice groups identified at higher risk, for example, real estate and other transactional activities. Before concluding my remarks, I would like to comment briefly on the issue of beneficial ownership information, and specifically the current lack of verifiable information. As I've already mentioned, the proposed amendments to the Federation's model rules would add a requirement for legal counsel to obtain and verify information on the beneficial owners of organizations and the beneficiaries of trusts. We are aware of criticisms of Canada in this regard, and we recognize the value of capturing this information. We have to stress, however, that compliance with such a rule, which would mirror the requirements in federal regulation, will be very difficult and in some cases likely impossible in the absence of publicly accessible registries of beneficial owners. It's my understanding that FINTRAC's guidance indicates that obtaining information on beneficial owners only from the client does not constitute verification of that information. That makes complete sense, but at the moment, it is the only option available for lawyers. It is the view of the Federation and law societies a rule that cannot be complied with is not a reasonable nor an effective rule. For that reason, we urge the government to move forward quickly with legislative amendments that would not only require organizations and trusts to record beneficial ownership information and to provide it to the government, but to also establish a publicly accessible registries of that information for lawyers to use across the country. We recognize that federal legislation will only reach a small percentage of corporations, and we hope that the government will push the provinces and the territories to follow suit and to do so without delay. We should also add that consideration should be given to extending rules on recording and sharing beneficial ownership to the ownership of real property. Mr. Chairman, I want to conclude my remarks by saying that in their testimony before this committee, a number of witnesses have indicated an interest in engaging with the legal profession on this issue. On behalf of the Federation and on behalf of our members, I can say without reservation that we would welcome the opportunity to engage in that debate. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. And I might say I understand your consultations are over, I believe you said, on March 15th. So anything further you could forward to the committee. We don't expect to table a report actually until we hope to complete it by June, but we won't be tabling it till October or September, October. So anything more that you could forward to us would be helpful. Ms. Johnson is here as an individual. Welcome, Ms. Johnson, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. Oh, it's in. So I'm a lawyer working in the fields of anti-corruption and anti-money laundering. C'est un très grand plaisir d'être invité aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup.
I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for having me.
Make sure that these get into the record of the committee. Given the shortage of time, I'm just going to kind of quickly make a number of brief points. First, I welcome the announcement by the federal and provincial finance ministers in December regarding making corporations more transparent. I would recommend that Canada follow the example set by European Union jurisdictions in creating public beneficial ownership registries. I will leave with the clerk a copy of this report, which highlights best practices and lessons learned from European Union efforts. They've got quite a couple years under their belt, and it would be useful to look at that. But I would also highlight one point from this report, which is that beneficial ownership registries must be fit for due diligence purposes. IDs and other information provided by corporations upon a corporation, for example, must be verified by the registrar, and risk-based due diligence must be performed. The registrar should have an anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism mandate, which currently is not the case with the business registries. If criminals can simply provide fraudulent information to the registry and then repeat the same fraudulent information to a bank or a law office and say, well, just check the federal registry, then that registry will be useless, and banks and others will not be able to rely on it for due diligence purposes. So a verified risk-managed registry will cost more, but there will be aggregate savings across the economy and even within government, because right now you have all kinds of people doing the same due diligence on the same companies, and you could really simplify that. Federal provincial cooperation would be required to create a one-stop portal to conveniently search all registries. Second, I'd recommend the creation of new legal duties for nominees, agents, trustees, essentially people representing third parties, including nominee shareholders and directors. Those representing others should be required to always disclose their status as well as the identity of the third parties they represent to federal and provincial officials, including beneficial ownership registrars, as well as financial institutions, designated non-financial businesses and professions. Currently, in the statute, financial institutions and others have an obligation to ask clients if they are representing third parties, but there's no statutory obligation to answer this truthfully. Third, all designated non-financial businesses and professions should be required to inquire about beneficial ownership of corporations, entities, and arrangements as part of their due diligence obligations, but only when processing large cash transactions. So obviously this would be a huge burden on businesses, but not if there's a public beneficial ownership registry that's convenient and contains all the information. That would make it a very simple task. Fifth, I just wanted to briefly address the role of lawyers in the money laundering scheme. As we heard, there are rules in place by the Law Society and enforced by the Law Society, not by FINTRAC. These rules, as such, are very useful, and in my view, the no cash over $7,500 is excellent and really, really an important rule. Personally, I would take some of these rules further, but this is actually there's a process is ongoing right now. there are a lot of questions raised about the efficacy of this regime, and I feel myself that more empirical data is required to fully answer them. For example, what is the extent of the problem? Do we know? Do we understand? Because money laundering is very difficult to detect. There's no dead body. It's actually, how do we know, what the extent of the problem is? What are the possible advantages and disadvantages to restoring lawyers' cash due diligence record-keeping obligations in the statute as opposed to just leaving them in the rules? Because of solicitor-client confidentiality, detection of these crimes must occur in other parts of the financial system. So as a simple example, imagine a situation where a lawyer were to deposit huge volumes of cash into his or her trust account and presume violation of the rule. Would a bank be more likely to flag this to FINTRAC as a suspicious transaction if it were a legal breach than a rule of the law society? What about judges issuing warrants? I mean, what is the impact of there being a legal scheme versus the current scheme? These are the types of questions I think we need to answer in order before we decide whether or not the statute is the right place for due diligence obligations. In terms of who should supervise the enforcement of these rules, I mean, it's pretty clear from the Supreme Court decision that it's unconstitutional for FINTRAC to access lawyers' files in the absence of a warrant and leveille procedures. So this will always hamper FINTRAC's ability to be a supervisor of lawyers. So even if this committee were to conclude that due diligence obligations for lawyers should be restored to the Act, could the Law Society remain the supervisor and enforcer of those obligations? This is currently the case in certain other jurisdictions, such as the English bar, and it might be a possible solution to some of the difficult issues. I also wanted to add 6, that if the government plans to simplify the prosecution of money laundering offenses, including facilitating money laundering by reducing the mens rea to a reckless or willfully blind or negligent standard, then a defense should be provided to lawyers and others of a reasonable due diligence. And last, I just wanted to mention something about Export Development Canada, which, as I understand it, is currently exempt from the Proceeds of Crime Act because it does not accept deposits. However, recent media reports of its support for corrupt transactions have shown that it is at a high risk for handling the proceeds of crime. For example, if it makes loans of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to companies that obtain business through bribery, EDC is at risk of being repaid with proceeds of corruption, some of which goes into the government coffers through corporate dividends. While the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, Terrorism Financing Act is not ideally suited for these types of risks, it focuses a lot on deposits. There is currently no statutory due diligence obligations in place for EDC, and this might be something worth looking into as the committee reviews risks of proceeds of crime entering the financial system. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson, and we'll turn to 7-minute rounds. I would say during the rounds, one should never make assumptions, but I assume everybody has seen the finance discussion paper, and I think we're to a certain extent using that as background or a guideline. Whether we agree or disagree with what's in it at the end of the day, I guess we'll see. But if you do have any comments that you feel strongly about in that discussion paper, don't be afraid to raise them at any points during the question period, because I think that's what we need to target as well. So we'll turn to Mr. Fergus, 7 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Puis j'aimerais remercier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank the witnesses this afternoon. I'll give them a few moments to adjust the volume and the channel on the various headsets there for those who may be asking questions in French. I am one of those. Take your time, it's okay. I'll wait for you. Just give me a sign when you're done.
Voilà, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. You're on Channel 1. My questions will be addressed largely to Ms. Wilson, McPherson, and Johnson, because in the last few parliamentary reviews on this item, on this subject. The last two occasions, signaled out the lawyers' part in this and the shortcomings of the system itself. You did, in fact, draw to our attention, and it's an honor to your organization, to your profession, I should say, that you've limited cash receipts to 7,500, less than the FinTrack threshold. And for that, congratulations. So my first question goes to Ms. Johnson. In your fifth recommendation, you indicated that there would be obligations, so I'm not sure, due diligence obligations. Can you flesh out that recommendation a little bit? How can we in fact push on this recommendation and still be in respect of the Supreme Court decision? Thank you very much. Now, if I understood your question, I mentioned that I would amend the regulations. What would I do? Well, I'll answer the question in English.
So, as somebody who works on in the area of anti-corruption, so I'm just sensitive to some of the issues that come up in that context. So where lawyers are conducting financial transactions on behalf of clients, and they're using negotiable instruments at risk for money laundering, I would impose greater know your customer and due diligence obligations as appropriate to verify if clients are politically exposed persons, including family or close associates, so they're on sanctions list, or they're otherwise high risk. I would also require lawyers to make inquiries about the source of funds where in these types of cases. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So if you have someone in your office, if you're a lawyer and you have someone in your office and they've got negotiable instruments and they'd like to purchase a house, it'd be really good to know if, for example, they're on the sanctions list. Because people on sanctions lists, they need lawyers for certain purposes. But on the other hand, if they're supposed to have an asset freeze and they give you the stocks and bonds and bearer shares, it would be really useful to have that information. Similarly, it would be good to know if they're representing, the Mugabe family or someone, high risk for proceeds of corruption coming in. And so these are the types of obligations that are currently on the financial system. But as I said, it would, because of the no cash rule, it would really be when you have serious risk of money laundering. Because obviously everyone needs a lawyer from time to time for whatever reason, but I'm talking about these high-risk transactions and these high-risk situations.
So, Ms. Wilson, Ms. McPherson, from the Federation perspective, what is the current standing, and then how would you react to that proposal to have a higher level of a higher obligation on those potentially risky transactions?
Well, it may interest you to know, and Ms. Johnson to know, that the draft rules, and of course they're not finalized yet, but the draft rules are amendments to the client identification and verification rule, include requirements to inquire into source of funds. They include requirements that are ongoing, not simply at one point in time, but ongoing in the course of the relationship. And from what I've seen so far in terms of the feedback, I have every reason to believe that those provisions will survive the consultation period and be put forward as amendments to the rules. So I think Ms. Johnson and the Federation are on the same page on that, and law societies, based on the feedback that we received. In terms of politically exposed persons, this is, for us, a slightly more complex issue, but one which I co-chair the working group that's doing this work, and we have it on our list to pursue and to look into further. There are a number of things that our launching of our consultation predates the release of the government's white paper, the Department of Finance's white paper. There are a number of things that are in the white paper that we want to return to. So you may see that there will be more than one cycle or more than one round of amendments, because we would prefer not to wait to move forward with what we think are important amendments that will strengthen the rule until we have everything in it, until we've looked at all the other things we may also wish to add.
Subsequent question: what is the obligation of the Federation or its membership? At what point would you then be obliged, if you suspect that the proceeds of a client are illegally obtained? At what point are your members obliged to report?
I think, in fairness, it's not so much framed in the constating legislation as obligations, but more the powers that law societies have to share information, because, of course, they are bound by privacy laws and so forth, and because they enter into, when they investigate a lawyer, the sphere of privilege, which is to say that privilege is not waived or lost when the law society conducts an investigation, they have some obligations. Well, they have an absolute legal obligation to protect solicitor-client privilege, but they all also have the power to share information with law enforcement agencies and do so. Individual law societies have different policies as to when that is. I would note with some interest, however, that in our inquiries to the law societies, we've discovered that reports of suspicion of criminal activity, often it may be something like mortgage fraud, so it's not related, it's not restricted to money laundering activities, does not necessarily meet with any enthusiasm on the part of law enforcement to investigate. Indeed, sometimes what the regulators are told is, well, you acted, you've suspended or disbarred the member. We have compensation funds and insurance funds which compensate the victims of these things, and so it is not unusual for there to be no further law enforcement action, even where there is a report. The other thing I think that needs to be said is that law societies are looking at their at compliance with their rules, and so, of course, when they audit, for example, audit a law firm, they look at the accounting records. They are looking for breaches of the no cash rules. They are looking for things that don't look right to them, but they're also looking in a broader context, and so it's not always about crimes. Right? It's often about regulatory failure to obey the regulations of the law societies.
Okay, sorry, Greg, you're well over. Mr. Albas.
Oh, and
Make it a second round.
I certainly will continue on some of this, so hopefully I'll catch some of the same ideas. Just in regards to it, I do understand that the process is where many might say in law enforcement where they have to go and get a judicial order, that in fact some of the processes you may have are more immediate and can be far more reaching because of multiple different complaints across different files, that you may ask for demand documents on a whole host of fronts. So I certainly appreciate that there is a system in place and that to the most part it works. I do have a question. Ms. Johnson had referred that there's not a lot of data that is shared. Now, is that something that the committee that is going to make recommendations is going to be making recommendations on?
Yes, in fact, we've begun our work on sort of best practices, and we have identified the lack of consistent data as a weakness and something we would like to see changed. I mentioned that law societies are enforcing their rules, and they keep pretty good data on the breaches of this obligation for accounting, for trust accounting, or breaches of this provision of the rules of professional conduct. But they have not been necessarily separating out from that breaches of the rules that are, although they also have other purposes, are aligned with or are intended to address the same objectives as the federal anti-money laundering and terrorism financing regime. A couple of law societies have begun to do that, and it will be our recommendation that we move to standardized and consistent data collection in this area.
That's important because for many people, the data would say that the system is performing or not. They could ask about trends and whatnot. But if you don't have that kind of forthcoming and there's anecdotal evidence, people may lose faith in that system, and then we would have to rejigger the system, I guess, to make sure, because we can't have any light between on these kinds of cases. And I do, understand there is a solicitor-client privilege that needs to be maintained. Now, just switching gears slightly, have you, either of you, or maybe even Ms. Johnson, heard of cases where courts, and I'm thinking at the provincial level, so there's civil claims, and certain lawyers may unwittingly be involved in money laundering? Some countries have capital requirements so that if they're going to bring money into another country like Canada, that they have certain stipulations for bringing in that capital. So one strategy that I have heard of anecdotally, because members of Parliament speak to all sorts of different people, I think that's a good thing. One of the things that they've said, though, or at least this particular conversation went, is that a subsidiary of a particular company doing business in Canada will make a private arrangement with another corporation or an entity. And that will be that they will create a contract and then break the contract, and then one of the parties will sue for damages. Obviously, the subsidiary would then take it to court, and then the court may find that that subsidiary broke contract and demand payment, which then goes to the host country, which of course they require a court order to have those monies. Then those monies are distributed or brought into Canada and then distributed for other purposes than what they were intended. Have you heard of this kind of strategy? And if so, is it being addressed by your committee?
We've talked about and worried about that kind of strategy on the committee that I co-chair. I can't say that I have had any of the people I'm working with are people working directly in investigations and enforcement and so on activities of the Law Society. So they are they're not the politicians, they are the people who are doing that work. And I have not heard of any specific examples, but I will say that while this only deals with cash, our rule, no cash rule, picked up some exceptions that come out of the federal regulations, although, of course, that's about suspicious transaction and large cash reporting. That included I can't recall whether this is right out of the regulations or whether it simply seemed like a good idea at the time, back in 2004. But the no cash rule includes an exception for money that is paid as a result of a court order, which could include exactly what you're talking about. And we've actually said that we don't think that's an exception that we should maintain. We think it should come out of the rule. Again, that's only dealing with cash, but we looked at it and said, well, it's a clunky way to launder money, but if you were a major corporation with a major contract with very high stakes, for example, it could be nonetheless effective way to deal with large quantities of money, and we've taken that out. But beyond that, I can't say that I have anything more specific to offer it to that question.
Court order is issued awarding damages, and then money is transferred from a foreign jurisdiction into Canada. Does FINTRAC, are they aware of that and for the rationale for that? Because if someone was to have multiple payments over a series of time, perhaps that may show up. Again, I'm not privy to whether or not this is something that's done one big shot at a time, or if it's done over a series of different contracts being broken with different entities. So to me, the question is, though, are we creating, is there a structural ability where we're allowing our courts, which, to be fair, when I talk to people, many people feel that they're not able to see their case as quickly as they'd like. I'd like to know if this is a small problem or even if it is a problem, and whether or not there should be some oversight on some of these court orders to make sure that FINTRAC or the law societies are able to account for them. And to flag them if there's an issue.
I'll just say one thing and then I'll defer to Ms. Johnson, as I think she may actually have more insight to offer you than I do on this. But your question really demonstrates to me the important point to keep in mind, and that is that there are in many cases, in many transactions, there are a number of players, some of whom have reporting obligations, some of whom may not. the courts don't, and of course lawyers don't, but banks do, right? And so it's always important, I think, and we've talked about this a lot in our work, to think about that web. We actually, on a sort of tangentially related point, have a concern about the fact that it is possible for somebody to deposit money into somebody else's account. So if you are a lawyer with a trust account, it is possible for someone to go to the bank and deposit cash into your trust account or in another form. And you can't stop it. And I mean, we've talked to banks, there's some possibility of flagging the account that they're supposed to phone, but it's very porous. And we are unable, in many cases, to get that information from the banks as to who made the deposit. So I mention that only because it's a tangled web, right? And so with many players, each of whom may present a risk and may have a role to play in the monitoring activities. But I imagine Ms. Johnson has more.
Ms. Johnson, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Yeah, no, I think that you raise a fascinating question, and I don't know the answer to the question you asked, but it raises a much larger issue, which I think I touched upon when I talked about EDC, which is that this statute that you're reviewing and all this work that you're doing is really focused on deposits and flow through. Which is where the major risk of money laundering is. So when a trust account is used for flow through, like a real estate transaction, and say in the old days when they took cash, I mean that's where there was really huge risks, and same with a financial institution. But actually, that's not the extent of all the risks. That's really just the ones the statute focuses on. And I know the Law Society rules include things like, client fees, bail. There's other exceptions as well. Again, where it's not a flow through. And same with the rules for financial institutions, which is why EDC is not covered at all. So this might be a larger theme that the committee might consider looking at, is money laundering risks or risks of receiving the proceeds of crime. In cases where you're not looking at a flow-through, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you all. Mr. Dussault, 7 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et d'abord, j'aimerais juste...
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank all the witnesses for their presentations. And these very well thought out comments that you're making. Ms. Johnson, perhaps something to follow up on what you mentioned earlier. I believe it was you. Verified risk management registry to ensure that the information found therein is accurate, reflects reality, and is in fact updated in a regular fashion. Can you give us an example for the committee that we might cite, or that the public registry is good, that those who are contributing to it make it so that we can, in fact, confirm its veracity and its correctness? Do we have the authority, the power to? Does the regulation have teeth? In other words, as we say in common English. It's an excellent question. When I reviewed that report, I didn't see any specific examples, but it is, in fact, an issue that's been raised in Europe frequently.
Would be, and maybe just to go like one step further, is if the registry, so currently the federal government registry for corporations is completely passive. So people send the information, you create a new corporation, and the information simply gets transferred into the registry. There's no verifications, not even ID checks, not even like show your driver's license and confirm the person even exists. So right now, but of course it was never created for anti-money laundering purposes. So, but this can be changed with a registrar. And I think, a registrar who's able to do those kinds of verifications. Obviously, the more the verifications they do beyond just ID checks, the more expensive and cumbersome and complicated the process is. So a risk-based process might also work, which means that person is someone who with skills, compliance skills, understands how corporations are formed and so on and so forth, and is able to flag suspicious things, maybe send reports to FINTRAC, maybe contact the corporation for more information, ask for more documents. So this is sort of what we have in mind is someone who's able to really sort of uphold the rigor of the registry.
Peut-être sur une autre question que vous n'avez pas abordée, mais qui pour moi.
Perhaps on another issue that you didn't raise, but might present a risk. We know that often corporate enterprises are very complexly structured, and often it overlaps in a sense of covering several countries. If there are many entities or affiliates within the same corporate structure, perhaps there's some risk involved there. In some countries, perhaps there's no domestic regulation or law that says this process may occur or not, and in another country it's allowable. Is that something else we should be looking at?
One of the recommendations that I made in this report is that any complex corporate structure, so where a company is a 100% shareholder of a subsidiary, is a 100% shareholder of another, or even more complex, that the whole chain be included, that all the related companies be part of the disclosure. The other thing is, when we're talking about beneficial owner, we're really talking about the ultimate beneficial owner. So that cuts through all of the chains to the ultimate or owners. But you're certainly right that in some cases, even for one simple corporation, it's not always clear and obvious who the beneficial owners are. And there's a control definition, which would typically include directors, and then there's a benefit or ownership, which is who owns the shares, for example. But sometimes, in a family-owned business, there might be a patriarch who actually has the powers pursuant to a unanimous shareholder agreement to dismiss all the directors and hire and fire everyone. And that person clearly would be a beneficial owner in the control arm, even if they're not listed as a shareholder, for example, or a director. So it's a really complicated issue, which again requires a sophisticated, knowledgeable registrar who would, some are basic, but others would require the registrar to go back and ask more questions, follow up, seek more documents, and go deeper. Thanks.
Peut-être sur le temps qui me reste sur
With the time that I have left, my question might be addressed to the Federation. Federation, let me take a look at the name officially, Federation of Law Societies of Canada. I believe it might have been Ms. Johnson that referred to the mens rea. I'm not sure. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to be careful with my choice of words. But the comparison, the paradigms, if you will, it's based more on mens rea. You have to prove intent. Whereas with due diligence, we just have to ensure that it wasn't willingly blind to something, turn a blind eye to. If there was something suspicious. Can you explain the nuance between the two? And should we be trying to aim for something that perhaps is more due diligence or more mens rea? Well, Ms. McPherson, perhaps.
That's an excellent question. In the regulatory world, a lawyer can commit an infraction of the rules intentionally, and that would not only be something that would be professional misconduct, but it would likely also be criminal misconduct. If somebody were knowingly engaged in money laundering, for example, they should be caught by law society enforcement, but they would also be caught by the larger criminal systems that we have. But lawyers can also be targeted for breaching rules because they're acting negligently or without oversight. So they don't necessarily have to intentionally mean to participate in money laundering if their practices and structures are sloppy or careless. If it's an oversight, that can be a breach of and lawyers can be disciplined for breaching the Law Society Code. And a good example is client identification. Sometimes lawyers get busy. They may not properly identify their clients. They don't intend to break that rule, but those type of failures should be caught through a Law Society auditing process, and the lawyer can be disciplined for that even though they didn't intend to breach it. So the negligent performance, the lack of attention and detail doesn't need to be intentional, and that is the strength of having a number of different layers. The Law Society can act not only on intentional wrongdoing, but on negligent wrongdoing, and even on wrongdoing that occurs simply because you believe you're doing the right thing, but you end up not being able to, you don't comply with the rules for whatever reason. That can still be a breach. It may be a defense in terms of how you deal with the complaint or prosecution that you've tried to do your very best, but it can certainly be a breach. And I don't know, Ms. Wilson, if you wanted to add anything.
Well, very briefly, I'm respectful of everybody's time, but I do want to say there's very, I started my career as a criminal lawyer. It's a long time since I was practicing, so I don't want to misspeak, but there is very well-developed law on mens rea and strict and absolute liability offenses, and they are tied to, in part, the consequences that may prevail. So if there's a risk of imprisonment and so forth, there's a higher standard required when we're talking about the criminal law, and of course quasi-criminal, which are regulatory offenses, can be regulatory offenses. So my only comment on this would be that while, of course, it may be interesting to explore a lower standard of proof, which is what we're talking about, you need to proceed cautiously in that area so as not to run up against what I said, as I said, is very well established law on what is permissible depending on, this has to do with the charter, it has to do with your charter rights and your ability to make full answer and defense in the face of serious potential sanctions.
Okay, thank you all. Turning to Ms. O'Connell, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with Ms. Richard and Mr. Land, get you in this a little bit. In terms of, are there any requirements, and forgive me if you said this at the beginning and I didn't catch it, but in terms of reporting of large sales of jewelry to FINTRAC or other bodies?
Yes, there is. Are you referring to large cash transactions?
Well, not just cash, but I could see this being a very neat way to launder some money. What's the requirement?
Okay,
then?
For large cash transactions, it's over $10,000. They must be reported to FINTRAC. If there is a large transaction, but it is not cash, the only reporting requirement there would be if in some way it was suspicious or that you knew there was criminal activity involved.
Okay, and then you mentioned at the very end of your intervention, you mentioned the area of concern is auction houses. Can you elaborate? Because that's kind of where your delegation then ended.
The thing with auction houses is at the moment, one can go into a jewelry auction, and there are many, many of them across the country. Some move, some are permanent houses, and some of them are absolutely legitimately good businesses. But literally, you can go in there and have $200,000 in cash, and there's no requirement for a reporting to FINTRAC of that kind of transaction. There's no requirement for a suspicious report either, other than if it's a good corporate citizen, they would hopefully alert law enforcement. But it is a gap within the sector where there is a possibility of tightening it up.
Thank you. And what about on the other side of it for auction houses? For, let's say, individuals have, even if it's under the $10,000 cash limit, let's say they're right in at $8,000, $9,000, so the jeweler where they're purchasing the items aren't necessarily immediately flagged. But when you acquire several pieces of that value and then walking into an auction house to then sell them as basically like an estate sale or estate type situation, what are the requirements for auction houses to know their clients for the sale of this merchandise? Are you aware of any?
Not aware of any,
Okay.
other than obviously if a stranger's walking into any kind of sale environment, the seller wants to know who they are, or at least to know that they're verified and that if they write a check, the check won't bounce, that sort of thing. But there's no actual requirement.
Okay, thank you. In terms of, I'm going to turn back to the Law Society. In terms of the auditing process, can you tell me how many audits have occurred specifically around the money laundering, anti-terrorism financing regulations? Let's say in the last 5 years.
Well, the simple answer is no, because of the point I made earlier about how the data is collected. But what I can tell you is that law societies, all but our tiniest law societies, and as you'll appreciate, we have 3 northern law societies where they are required to do all of the same things as the larger law societies, but they are very, very, very much under-resourced, and so they face more challenges in terms of some of these activities and need to turn to some of their other fellow law societies to help them with this. So it may be a little more ad hoc. But all other law societies have regular audit programs that are random. I can tell you that the frequency ranges, for example, in Prince Edward Island, they audit everybody, every law firm every year. In Ontario, it would be roughly every law firm every 5 years. Manitoba, I believe it's something like every law firm every 3 years, just to give you, that just gives you a sample. I mention that because when they go in and audit, they are looking specifically, in addition to good accounting practices and compliance with the trust regulations of the Law Society, they are looking at no cash specifically, and they are looking at client identification and verification. And they will look at the way these audits are done. As you can appreciate, it's much like when when you have your books audited in your company, your sample files are pulled, and if they have any concerns about what they see, they pull more and look at them, as well as, of course, looking at all of the actual ledgers and transactions.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I am limited and I have several questions. So I recognize those audits. However, there's much more to that the legal community could be involved in terms of money laundering than just identification and cash. And oftentimes it's a lawyer setting up a corporation, setting up articles of incorporation, setting up all of the parameters around things that may actually be the tools being used for money laundering and financing of terrorism. So my questions around audits are important not just on the cash and identification points, but if law societies are essentially self-regulating this based on the Supreme Court decision around money laundering anti-terrorism legislation, how can the law societies demonstrate to governments, to the public, if it's not broken down into these audits being done to ensure that the legal community is adhering not just on the ID and no cash, but adhering to any suspicious behavior that could be in the realm of money laundering and terrorism financing? How can we as legislators feel comfortable that, and I read the Canadian Bar Association, and I recognize that's not your submission, but saying the majority of lawyers are following these regulations. How do we know that if there's no data to suggest that the audits are being done specifically targeted on this legislation? So how can we know this? And why is it that other common law jurisdictions are able to have more of a microscope and focus on the follow-up and the regulation of ensuring that this is actually being done and not just in those 2 areas of identification and cash?
I think the law societies are looking at enforcement of the rules that actually replicate or mirror what is contained federally. So rather than have enforcement occur through that vehicle, law societies are charged with enforcement, and those are things like cash and money laundering. The other area of enforcement is that lawyers' trust accounts are not used for purposes other than the provision of actual legal services. And as we indicated, the majority of Canadian lawyers are already governed by a rule in that regard, and indeed there have been prosecutions in relation to lawyers who have used their trust account for purposes other than the delivery of legal services. In other words, a repository of money inappropriately. And the proposed new rules would provide that all law societies will adopt a rule which will prohibit lawyers from using their trust accounts for purposes other than connected with the delivery of actual legal services. And that, I think, will be an important thing to bear in mind, and the law societies will be looking for enforcement of those issues. Through the issues generally of the role of corporations in money laundering, the challenge is if a lawyer sets up a corporation, they can be acting corporations are a legitimate way to do business. The lawyers can be acting completely appropriately. The corporation goes off and does its business. The lawyer has no subsequent involvement necessarily with that corporation in terms of its transaction. And so arguably the responsibility for looking at those corporate structures as vehicles of illegal activity rests through the corporate registry structure.
That's the exact point. When the lawyers continue to act in the mechanism for those corporations because there is a protection, because they are exempt. So there is a real benefit to keep the lawyer involved in the corporation moving forward because they're exempt if for the money laundering purposes. But anyways,
we'll have to end it there,
okay.
Ms. O'Connell. You're over, but I will let Ms. Johnson wants to add to the answer.
Yeah, just one little supplementary point to what was already said, which is that there are cases, there are actually numerous cases where the lawyer will actually act as the nominee shareholder, nominee director, and when law enforcement or banks or whoever is seeking information about the beneficial owner, the lawyer will say, well, that's solicitor-client privilege information, and so that is definitely been an issue. Although if the government passes beneficial ownership, if it changes corporate law, then that will actually remove any privilege from that information. So at that point, it's not privileged. In fact, it will be available in a public registry.
Thank you all. Mr. Albus, 5 minutes rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you to all of our witnesses for your attendance today. I'd like to start off with some the jewelers over here. Thank you again for coming and talking about your industry. Just wanted to ask a question. In regards to compliance cost, would you be able to share any ballpark with what the average jeweler has to do as far as their administrative compliance with FINTRAC? Do you have any tracking or any indication, whether it be anecdotal or something that has been bandied around in the industry?
We have nothing concrete that we can say that, it costs X amount of dollars. You must remember, going back to what my colleague said, so many of the jewelers in Canada that are captured are small independent businesses. It's, there's only sometimes 5 employees. So to develop and maintain a anti-money laundering compliance regime can be quite onerous because they're really not structured in that way. If you look at a financial institution, for example, it's top down, it's corporate, everybody falls into line. Jewelers just aren't like that. So I really don't have an answer that I could give you that would be.
Do you know if FINTRAC has done any consultations with your industry to kind of deal with this, to create some sort of standards? We had a witness the other day that had felt that his understanding of the rules were made only expressly clear after he was taken to court. That he had certain obligations. So is there any forward guidance to your industry or consultations by FINTRAC?
We've been talking to FINTRAC for almost a decade now. I would say that Yes, they do. I would say on a very positive side, though, we recently had a meeting with FinTrack where we really looked at the sector profile. They were, I think we really turned a corner in having them understand, you know, the uphill battle for a lot of the small businesses. So I think there is dialogue that's going on that I think is beneficial to both.
Because I could put myself in the shoes of a jeweler that would say, gee, if I sell these earrings as a pair, I'm going to have to file a report, and maybe I don't have time, so I'll just ring them up as $5,000 a piece, and then not have to do a submission. So I think it's really important that FinTrack engage with your industry, and that there's a better understanding of everyone's obligations as well as what the costs are, because if there's no measurement, then and the process is onerous, that might be the issue. Yes, Mr. Land.
I think that there's sort of two realities out there. There are the chains like Peoples and Burke's and so on, and in that environment, the system is automated. So if there was a transaction for cash over $10,000, the system demands, before the sale can be processed through the point of sale, it demands the information, and so it's automated. For the smaller jeweler, I think that the costs initially, that's where they are up front, setting up the compliance, following all the restrictions, and then on an ongoing basis, I think that the costs are not as significant once they have the compliance in place. And one of the things about our association is we have a benefit for our members that hook them up with a toolkit that makes the process easier.
Okay, and how? Obviously, your membership is voluntary, not forced, compelled.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd like just to go over to the law societies again, and I'm sorry I don't have enough time, Mr. Lane. Just in regards to the ability to send over cases to law enforcement, you said that sometimes they're just not interested. So I'd like to hear a little more about that. But also, in the cases where someone decides, you know what, there's an investigation going on, I'm going to parachute out, I'm going to resign and no longer practice as a lawyer or notary or whatever the association is. What mechanisms are there then for your system in terms of accountability? Does the case just stop, or does it get referred to law enforcement if that's the case?
Well, of course, I do want to clarify one thing. I don't know that law enforcement is not interested, but it may be a resource question, and it may be a response to the fact that some action has been taken, so I don't want to sort of smear law enforcement. But I do want to say that when a member is under active investigation or has been cited and is in the middle of a hearing or awaiting a hearing, they are not simply permitted to resign. They must apply for permission to resign or to withdraw their membership, and the Law Society will not necessarily agree to that if they think, for example, that the consequence of a successful prosecution will be disbarment. That's important. And even if they did, in appropriate circumstances, permit the member to resign, they still have the capacity and do share information with law enforcement.
Okay. Just briefly, on audits, you said that certain jurisdictions, Ontario, it's usually every 3 years. No, Manitoba, it's every 3 years, 5 years in Ontario. Do you feel that is a good thing to have various standards throughout the country, or do you think that there really should be a uniform audit process when we're talking specifically, because FinTrack does not apply, and it applies to every other industry? And I understand we're a common law country with a charter, though, and so we have to do these little workarounds to make sure there's there. Do you believe that there should be a uniform standard time for audit?
I do. I do think there should be a uniform standard, and we are working on that. However, the reality is, of course, that when you're regulating 50,000 lawyers, as the Law Society of Ontario does, compared to regulating a few hundred, as the Law Society of Prince Edward Island does, there are resource challenges. I want to add, however, that in addition to this sort of periodic random audit, process. Law societies engage in risk-based audits. They will target for re-auditing any law firm that they've gone into and had concerns about. They also engage in again, tends to be a targeted way, in practice audits where they'll have a more comprehensive look at a law firm. So the numbers I gave you really are for the random audit process.
Thank you, Mr. Sabara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your comments, everyone. I don't want to be repetitive with my colleagues, so I'm going to try to keep the questions shorter, if I can do that. In terms of the submission that was provided by the Federation of Law Societies of Canada, and everyone can open up, in terms of your point on the beneficial ownership, so basically what you've stated is that even if we have rules on beneficial ownership, if we don't have a registry, it's not effective.
That's correct. That's correct. Lawyers can verify. It makes verifying the beneficial ownership very, very challenging because FINTRAC has said that verifying, simply asking your client, verification through your client is not sufficient. There's no degree of enforcement. There's no degree of verifying that information is in fact accurate, and that's where a publicly accessible register with the ability to have some rigor around that would aid, I think, all lawyers.
Okay. And secondly, Ms. Johnson, you had commented, I almost want to call you, commented the fact that what we need to be able to discover is if a lawyer is representing a third party, and you had made a comment to that fact. Can you elaborate on that comment you made during your comments?
Sure. So one of the challenges with law enforcement and in this whole area is that often for perfectly legitimate reasons, corporations will create other corporations to run investments, or lawyers will act as nominees, or there'll be trustees acting on behalf of beneficiaries. So there are all kinds of situations where a third party will be acting for someone else. And it's not necessarily, especially if that person controls the financial, sort of the financial levers, it's not obvious at all that they're not the principal, but they're actually a third party. So, so in cases where third parties are acting, I just think it's really critical that they make banks, lawyers, trust companies, and government officials, including the registrar, aware that they're actually a nominee and who they're acting for. What are the names of the beneficiaries or the persons for whom they're acting?
We could, in your opinion, and obviously others, please chime in, get to a point where you could set up a registry, have the data available for, I think the comment was, must be fit for due diligence basis, i.e. Without violating, and I'm not a lawyer, so if I use language that's inappropriate, excuse me, violating or protecting the solicitor-client privilege. Johnson? And then
okay, if you want to take that first, please.
Well, it depends who you're asking for the information from. If you're requiring the corporation to file that information, if that is a requirement of corporate law that you provide, as you now have to for publicly traded or corporations, a variety of information, then it will have to go in the filings, or the corporation will not be able to be created and will not exist. If you're talking about ex post facto, asking lawyers who the beneficial owners are of corporations, that presents potential issues with regard to solicitor-client privilege. That's one of the reasons why we are so supportive of the idea of beneficial ownership registries, because it becomes a matter of corporate law. It's simply a requirement like many others. And in addition to those situations in which lawyers are creating corporations and they would have to, on behalf of their clients, comply with those requirements, there are other situations where lawyers aren't involved in creating the corporations, but where we are seeking and to impose an obligation on them to know who the beneficial owners are, and this will provide a mechanism for them to be able to verify the information they get from their clients.
And I'm taking the experience with the European Union with regards to their because they've been done a number of years, with regards to their registry, they've been able to do it without layering, what I call adding cost to entities doing business and stuff, they've been able to do it efficiently and effectively?
That's our understanding. And one of the challenges of doing it at the local lawyer level is that every lawyer will have verification differently, and the implementation will be uneven across the country. Whereas if there is a national registry, that is likely the most cost-efficient, and I've read some articles that you've done on this topic, the most cost-efficient way of achieving the ultimate objective. And of course, this is also a provincial territorial issue as well.
I was actually just going to comment on that because, you know, in Canada, I would like to have a national securities regulator, if I can say that. And I was just thinking if the same issues would arise between in unison having a national registry for beneficial ownership, the same sort of territorial, provincial, federal issues.
Very much so.
Okay, we'll have to move over to the other side. But on this point, the lack of central registry, how then do you have any suggestions on how you deal with the provincial aspect? I mean, we're talking about federal jurisdiction here. Is the only way to address that issue with meetings and agreements between the provincial and federal ministers to come to an agreement, or is there other areas to deal with that problem? Because you're only dealing with part of the equation when you're looking at the feds. Any suggestions?
Maybe if I can take it first.
Or what's the gap
Yep.
that's left when we don't have the ability to deal with the provincial side?
So as you're aware, corporations can be incorporated federally, provincially. Provinces are responsible for partnerships of all kinds. There's other business arrangements as well, and trusts. That's also provincial. So my understanding from the announcement made by the finance ministers in December is that all the provinces have agreed to make changes to their corporate law statute to require the disclosure of beneficial ownership information. So that's an excellent beginning. Whether or not, in terms of the creation of registries, because of federal provincial responsibilities, my proposed solution would be, and I mean, you can't really get away from those responsibilities, would be that there'd be cooperation to set up a single portal and search engine which could pull information from all of the registries. And by the way, these registries already exist. They're called business registries or corporate registries. They don't currently contain beneficial ownership information, but they could. So they could be amended. Undoubtedly, it will be like a bit of a patchwork over time, but presumably with a commitment which exists right now, we'll get there, and then it would be most convenient for businesses to be able to have one search engine that can pull all of the data from all of the registries at once.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Going back to a remark that Ms. Wilson made early on in this meeting, you spoke, and I know that Mr. Albus touched on this as well, the lack of what you said was the lack of enthusiasm for prosecution, and you specifically identified mortgage fraud, and the prevention of mortgage fraud is something I know something of from my professional life prior to public life. And I was pleased to hear you acknowledge the lack of enthusiasm for prosecution of this, because it's real. We had at a previous meeting some discussion of this, and I'm pleased that you were able to get this into the record, that there is often a lack of enthusiasm for prosecutions of fraud in general, and mortgage fraud is a particular type of fraud that is often done in order to facilitate money laundering. What are the solutions around this? How can we get law enforcement and encourage the prosecution of fraud? It's a serious crime, and one that it seems that law enforcement agencies throw their hands up over.
Well, I know from the Law Society experience that they are complex and difficult to investigate and difficult to prosecute as a result. Certainly one that has any sophistication to it. I imagine and therefore, they take quite a commitment of resources. I'm no expert on law enforcement, but if I had to guess, if a law enforcement agency looks at an individual who is potentially guilty of mortgage fraud and sees that they have been prosecuted by their law society, that their law society has disbarred them, it would be almost certainly an offense for which you would get disbarred, and has compensated potential victim through the Law Society's lawyer-funded compensation funds. I imagine in the world of scarce resources, which I understand law enforcement labors under, that it may seem like quite a lot has already been done in that particular case, and that therefore the public interest imperatives of a prosecution may be partially satisfied. From my perspective, a huge part of the solution is a resource question. And of course, that I know you've heard. I've read the testimony so far before the committee. I know that there are many people saying there are resource problems, and that's part of the challenge for FINTRAC, for example. I suspect it is a problem for law enforcement at every level, and is one that requires money.
And yet your own answer to the response, to my way of thinking, partially debunks that question of resources, because when the Law Society or another professional regulatory body actually does contribute the resources and professional investigative skill and prosecutorial skill, the Law Society would have its own lawyers that prepare a fraud case for a disbarment process. The same thing is, my experience in Alberta with the Real Estate Council of Alberta. It has resources to investigate fraud and to professionally prepare a case. It's almost like the case is then handed with a ribbon on it to public prosecution or to law enforcement to go to that next stage. Is that not?
Well, I think there are two important things to remember. The first is that law societies exist solely for the purpose of regulating the profession and the public interest, and I believe from what I see that they take that responsibility very seriously, so they would feel they have no option but to proceed. They also have a lower burden of proof. So the standard of proof in a law society prosecution, it's not a criminal prosecution, does not have to meet the threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt. And I know that when prosecutors, law enforcement provincial and federal prosecutors are looking at issues, they look at the likelihood of conviction, and the fact that there is a higher standard of proof to be met is sometimes a reason not to proceed with the case.
Okay, short one? Are you okay? Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for coming to present here today. I have a question to the jewelers. I come from the Northwest Territories, and we have a number of diamond mines operating there, and we have agreements with the diamond mines to provide the rough stones to different polishing companies, different people that are going to cut and polish them. And I understand that the industry is fairly well regulated in terms of the finished product and that type of the jewelry. But does either of your organizations provide oversight for the organizations that take in these rough stones, the stones that are discolored, the stones that are not as desired? I see companies over the years come into the north, and they're from different countries. They're foreign owned, and I'm just wondering, once they have the stones in their hands, who's watching? That's my first question.
Interesting question, but first, under the Act, miners, cutters, polishers are not covered, so the Act doesn't apply to them. Having said that, certainly government wants royalties from the resource that comes out of the ground. So it would be, I would imagine, to Natural Resources Canada or another government agency that would be monitoring that sort of thing. The vast majority, in fact, to my knowledge, all the rough that comes out of any mine anywhere in Canada leaves the country and goes to a sorting facility, Antwerp, London, somewhere else, and then some of it is returned. I think even, I could be wrong on this, but I think even the small amount of rough that is cut and polished in Canada, which is diminishing all the time, has left the country and comes back. So in there somewhere, there would be another government agency, I would think, that would have oversight on it.
Thank you. My next question is also to the both of you. And because I wasn't clear and I didn't understand the use of cash, is it still possible for somebody to buy large amounts of jewelry with cash?
Absolutely. Yes, certainly. It's not, I wouldn't say it's a common occurrence, and of course FINTRAC could speak to that because of all the cash transactions that we report as a reporting sector. But certainly cash can be used at retail, although again, the most common form would be debit card or credit card in terms of paying for a piece of jewelry.
One more question. How about digital currencies? Is that something that your industry is that a common practice?
No, digital currencies are not used to my knowledge in Canada.
Okay, thank you. My next question is to the Law Society of Canada. It was mentioned that there was really no the oversight of the transactions that happen within your membership is not something that it's based on trust. And it was mentioned that the FINTRAC didn't have a role anywhere in it. Would that be something that could be incorporated so there is some kind of better, so that more people will have faith in the system?
Right. I think if, Mr. McLeod, if the takeaway is that there isn't any oversight, that's not accurate. I think through the no cash rule and the client identification rule, there is oversight of ensuring the enforcement of those rules, which actually mirror the federal rules, and in some cases are actually stricter than the federal rules in that we're not allowed to take as much cash. For example, it's $7,500 instead of $10,000. The federal rules. So there is oversight in terms of ensuring enforcement of those rules, and there's oversight in terms of generally of ensuring that lawyers comply not only with those rules but with their professional obligations, and where there are concerns that a lawyer may be an unwitting dupe, for example, of a money laundering scheme, then there can be reporting, and that lawyer can be investigated and scrutinized through the regulatory process as well as the criminal process. So there's a couple of different layers of oversight. With the new proposed rules, we will be looking at even greater oversight and hopefully greater collection of data that will allow us to come back and talk about that oversight in a way that makes sense.
Does that include FINTRAC?
Yes. I'm going to ask Ms. Wilson to answer that.
Prior to the introduction of the client identification and verification rules, we had extensive discussions / negotiations with the Department of Finance and FINTRAC to explore ways in which we might be able to avoid the constitutional battle that we then had. Where there was at that time, and I anticipate there would be now, a willingness to try to work with those organizations in a constitutionally compliant way. So what does that mean? It means that the information that lawyers obtain from their clients in the course of the solicitor-client relationship, and that is distinct from something you might do, it's purely business and nothing to do with providing or legal advice or representation, is protected by solicitor-client privilege, and lawyers are no more allowed to share that, to breach that, to share that information than anybody else is, because that is the law, and the privilege belongs to the client. But there's quite a lot of information that might be able to be provided to FINTRAC, for example, in an aggregate form, in ways that identify potential patterns. Ms. Johnson and I were talking about this before, about typologies and so forth. And the reaction of FINTRAC at the time was that they were not interested if we were not talking about enforcing the federal regulations. We remain willing to talk.
Okay.
Is that it?
One more question.
Go ahead.
I'm just
Floor is
curious.
yours.
$7,500 is a lot of money to me, anyway. How common is it in your field, in your law society, to have people walk in with $7,500 worth of cash, or?
It's not common at all. I know that cash, and in the north, the no cash rule encountered some challenges, and in smaller places, the no cash rule encountered some challenges, because sometimes you go into the community, somebody wants to retain a lawyer to do something, and they only have cash because they don't often have ready access to bank accounts or checks and that sort of thing, and so that became a important reporting issue, or an important limitation issue for us to try to deal with, to make sure that we were able to allow people in small communities, perhaps without access to checking accounts, to still have access to legal services. But I can tell you it happens very, very, very rarely. I can't think of a time in the last 20 years where I've come across that amount of cash in my own practice.
Just quickly, it may interest you to know we surveyed. We did some surveying of that in the work of our committee, and we went to criminal lawyers in particular, thinking that they might actually be more likely recipients of cash, and it's actually not common. So I think what Ms. McPherson says is absolutely correct, that it is very much the exception these days.
Okay, thank you all. We'll turn to Mr. Dussault, and we will have time if somebody else wants to ask one more question or another round of 5. So let me know. Mr. Dussault.
Merci. Je vais me tourner vers les bijoutiers d'abord.
Thank you, and I'd like to address the jewelers first. I was quite surprised to hear that you can walk into an auction house or an auction sale and sell anything in any quantity without any verification of identity or as to the source of the goods. I think that's something we have to look at in a little more detail. Now, I understand that there are some reporting responsibilities, 10,000 and over. It applies to pretty much any business. How about the other high-end, high carriage trade, high goods, what we call it carriage trade? They might be having access to objects or goods that come from crime, proceeds of crime of some sort. Do you know if there's any other sectors that have responsibilities vis-a-vis FINTRAC?
They have their own requirements for identification, but there's no requirement for them to report it further to FINTRAC. To your point about other luxury goods outside of a house, no. We are the only ones so far captured under the Act. In the UK, for example, instead of the requirement being for a particular industry, or like jewelers, for example, they call them high-value dealers. And it is illegal to accept, I think it's over £10,000, in cash, unless you are a registered high-value dealer. And that applies to whether you're buying a diamond ring, a car, a boat, designer clothing, anything. If you are going to engage in that level of cash transaction, you must register as a high-value dealer. Otherwise, it's illegal to accept the cash.
Intéressant. Sinon, j'aimerais revenir sur...
I'd like to come back on the issue of the public registers and the businesses. What about using false identities? Could there not be, or aliases? Perhaps there's some agreement among or between the members of a family or a group or even non-related individuals that the individual will act as a front on behalf of another person. And there's really, in fact, there's no way for anybody who is responsible for a registry to know that. So the beneficial owner may not, in fact, be able to be identified correctly. Is there any way we can capture that, capture, yes, that type of strategy? You know, can we uncover these things when they happen? You know, an incorporation doesn't require necessarily the assistance of a lawyer. There's all sorts of self-help kits on that. So how can we overcome that?
In the world of corruption, because PEPs, politically exposed people, they're so famous. It's almost universal to use an associate or an agent and so on. So one thing that I should mention is banks use really commonly commercial databases like WorldCheck. I don't know if you've heard of this. There are other ones as well. And what they do is when their new client walks in the door, they run the name through this database, and this database will flags all kinds of fascinating information, including whether they're a relative or an associate, known to be an associate of a politically exposed person, whether they're on a sanctions list or they have criminal convictions. Anything that's in the public domain, Thomson Reuters and different companies gather vast amounts of data and put them in this, and it's quite expensive to have a subscription, but banks do this. So it's quite, while an innocuous person walks into the bank, but certainly they can flag suspicious or red flags. And my hope would be that a registrar would do the same. You can't be sure, but it would create a red flag for enhanced due diligence, more inquiries, and that sort of thing. The other thing that's kind of useful about a registry, especially if it has really good searchability, is that you can start to see certain patterns. For example, it's not uncommon for an agent working for a corrupt person to actually work for many corrupt people, and this name starts popping up more frequently. Or you might have one address that has a surprising number of shell corporations. So these patterns are impossible to detect. But if you get a large amount of data, you can start to maybe see suspicious areas. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, I see the bells are ringing. If I could just ask two questions. Mr. Land, in your statement, you said that you strongly believe that a better understanding of the fabric of our industry by the Department of Finance and FinTrack would lead to more realistic compliance requirements and in turn a much higher rate of compliance from your industry. What do you mean by that? What needs to be done there?
Well, I believe that, as you know, the jewelry industry in Canada, from our remarks, we represent about 1,000, 1,200 doors in that range. There are probably 5,000 jewelers in Canada. So one of our challenges, because we speak for the jewelry industry, but we don't have all jewelers belonging to our group. So one of our challenges is to get the word out to other jewelers to help them understand the requirements, because we're constantly getting feedback from some of our consultants and partners that, again, compliance among non-members might be lacking.
Okay, thank you. And we do hope to avoid any making recommendations that will cause any more constitutional wrangles. We want to avoid that. But there's no question that beneficial ownership is one of the key areas that we have to get into, I think, in terms of our recommendations. There's been some good suggestions here. Is there anything else you want to add in terms of closing those loopholes And is there any other prime examples, I guess, we should be looking at from other countries? We understand the UK, I think, has a pretty reasonably good system, but have you got anything to add in that area, any of us? Ms. Johnson?
I think maybe the final comment that I would make about that is that many countries explored different types of registries, tiered access. There were lots of questions about who should have access to it. Of course, law enforcement, tax authorities, but journalists, investigative NGOs, all kinds of people wanted access to it. And what many countries ended up deciding is that it was actually cheapest, simplest, to make the beneficial ownership registry public, even though they had started out not thinking that they would do that. So many jurisdictions have now gone public. Germany, I think Netherlands, France. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye on where that goes.
Ms. Wilson or Ms. McPherson?
Just to say that I think the devil will be in the detail in many respects, and I think it appears that there's quite a consensus perhaps emerging on the importance of addressing this issue both within the legal profession, within the committee, and within Canada's ministers of finance. I think it will be important to have the legal profession at the table because we do bring a unique perspective and we would like to be at the table. We haven't been at the table for reasons relating to the litigation, but that litigation ended 3 years ago, and we welcome the opportunity to talk through some of the challenges of implementing the objectives of the legislation, because we all want the same thing in the final analysis. Thank you so much for your time today. As a last thought, I should indicate that this issue is one of the top 3 priorities of the Federation. So it very much is something that we have our eye on, and we appreciate the opportunity to make these submissions here today.
I only wanted to say that in terms of the comment that was made about our failure in a centralized security regulator, I think Ms. Johnson is absolutely right that the approach on this issue doesn't require that there be a single regulator or a single registry, but more that there be integration so that the information is available across borders.
Okay, with that, thank you all for your information, and committee members, the bells, they are ringing. Meeting adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.